Good afternoon, folks. My name is Adrian Wren. I'm a project leader at Valley Vision, and I'm also manager of the Cleaner Air Partnership, or CAP, as we like to call it for short. I'd like to welcome you to the first virtual quarterly CAP luncheon of 2021. We are pleased to see so much interest in federal and state level advocacy to improve air quality in the Sacramento region. And as we emerge from a global pandemic with many links to air quality issues, those of us at CAP very much appreciate the continued support and interest in topics like this. So to better understand who's in the room, if you haven't already, please enter your info in the chat at the bottom of your screen. And while you're doing that, I can provide some background for those who are new to CAP events. The Cleaner Air Partnership was actually created in 1986. So we're celebrating our 35th year this year. We were created in 1986 by the Sac Metro Chamber and Breathe California Sacramento region. Valley Vision, my employer, actually began to manage it about 15 years ago, and it's currently a broad-based partnership which includes business leaders, environmental advocates, public health nonprofits, and our region's 5 air quality management districts, all working together to help the 6-county Sacramento region, plus a little slice of Solano County, protect public health and promote economic growth by advocating for clean air. So a big thank you to our event sponsors, the Sac Metro Air District, Teichert, SMUD, Sutter Health, Union Pacific, the Sacramento Association of REALTORS, the Placer County Air Pollution Control District, the Yolo-Solano Air Quality Management District, El Dorado County Air Quality Management District, and the Healthy Air Alliance. Thank you all. A little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. This meeting is being recorded and a link will be shared with you all early next week. Reminder, you can always find recordings of Valley Vision hosted events on our YouTube channel. And as you've likely noticed, this is a Zoom meeting, not a Zoom webinar. We want this to be interactive, so there will be regular breakpoints for our speakers to answer your questions. So if you have one that you'd like to verbalize, please use the raise hand function. Depending on your version of Zoom, it's either under the participants button or the reactions button. Those using the Zoom app on your iPhone or Android should also have this option. And then those of you calling in should dial *9 to raise your hand. And of course, those of you using the chat box, that is wonderful. You can ask questions there or raise your hand if you want to say something out loud. So now I'd like to introduce Jesse Flores. He is a Valley Vision Project Associate supporting both the Cleaner Air Partnership and our 21st Century Workforce projects. Jesse, why don't you go ahead and say hi?
Hi, everyone. Jesse, Project Associate, helping out. Great to see the turnout.
So Jesse will be running the slides and making sure everything goes off without a hitch. And then I will be tracking hand raises for Q&A. So we're going to actually start with a little bit of an icebreaker. We here at Valley Vision love Zoom polls. So I'm actually going to launch this guy. What are your plans for the spring? Spending time outdoors, seeing family, federal air quality advocacy, or spring cleaning? So I'll give you like 20 seconds to answer that. And then we'll actually get into the meat of today's conversation. All right, 10 more seconds. 5, 4, 3. Okay, we're going to share the results. So hopefully folks can see that. Overwhelmingly spending time outdoors. I think that makes a lot of sense after folks have been cooped up for a while. All right. 3 of you though, all about that federal air quality advocacy. So good to hear, you're in the right place. Okay. So with that, let's dive into the subject matter for today. So to give you just a roadmap of what we're going to be talking about today, it's broken down into 3 parts. So first, we're going to hear the latest intel back from Washington, D.C. from Miles. He is from the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. Love the acronym. And we'll be hearing from him about what's happening in D.C. related to air quality. We'll then hear about federal advocacy priorities for our region from Erik White. He's a CAP Executive Committee member and Air Pollution Control Officer at the Placer County Air Pollution Control District. And then last but not least, we'll shift to a state level priorities conversation with Alberto Ayala, Executive Director and Air Pollution Control Officer at the Sac Metro Air District. So with that, Erik, I'm now turning it over to you to introduce our friend Miles. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And I'm glad to see that we've got 63 of us here today to talk about clean air issues in the Sacramento region and how we continue to move the ball forward in terms of improving air quality on a regional basis in our local communities here. Today, we're fortunate to have, I don't want his head to get too big, but a very special guest. The executive director, as Adrian mentioned, Miles Keogh from NACAA. I think Miles has been with NACAA now about 3 years or so. And I have the pleasure of working fairly closely with him right now in my role as the co-president of NACAA, representing local agencies across the country in the work that NACAA does, as well as serving as a co-chair in NACAA on the Mobile Source and Fuels Committee, which covers issues around fuel quality, but probably more importantly around vehicle standards and other types of measures relating to mobile sources, both at the federal level that US EPA does, as well as what goes on in states such as California here. Just a little bit of info on Miles before I turn it over to him. Miles has a very long and extensive background in the energy sector. When he came to NACAA, he brought that with him, which has served us well. And I think as we start talking about federal issues and the potential for transportation and infrastructure funding that's going on in Congress right now, I think that's going to serve all of us well in terms of being able to represent how we start to plan for an electrified mobile source sector moving forward. And so I will turn it over to Miles, but I will mention one thing. And Miles, I just realized this about you in reading a bio online. I did not realize that you were an ambulance driver for some time. So talk about having a very varied background, which we all do. That was an interesting fact I had never known. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Miles to walk through what's going on in DC.
Nice. Thanks, Eric. Let me just start by saying how much I appreciate an opportunity to interact with y'all. I always get so much out of these meetings with folks from the California Capital Region and the cap to cap meetings that y'all organize. And I always learn a ton from these things, from the good questions you ask, from the feedback that you share. And so I'm looking forward to learning from y'all again. It's also super nice to see a number of NACAA member agencies on the call. Shout outs to Feather River and Yolo-Solano, and of course, Dr. Ayala's crowd and the Placer County team. And there's a whole bunch of y'all in here, and it's just fantastic. And I'm just really looking forward to getting an opportunity to interact with y'all. I'm pretty informal, as you've probably already figured out. So go ahead and stop me anytime if you have questions or anything like that, or if you want to hang on till Adrian and the squad there say it's Q&A time, we can do it then too. Let me go ahead and hop to the next slide. I should also just mention my Weasley disclaimer. I'm going to do my best to be helpful to y'all, and helpfulness requires just a little bit of candor. And with candor comes the inevitable risk of being put out in the homeless shelter by one of my 155 air director bosses. So today I'm speaking only for myself, but I'm going to try and give you a good sense of what my pulse taking is of what's going on here in DC as we kind of get into a new administration, a new Congress, new all kinds of stuff. And I'll try to keep it pointed towards context that'll be helpful to y'all as you're thinking about how do you engage successfully on air quality issues that are beneficial to your part of the Golden State. Today, I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the NACAA priorities that are out there, some of the new faces that are here in DC, some of the executive orders that came down, some of the changes in the regulations that we're expecting, some of the changes that we're seeing up on the Hill, some of the court action that's going to affect what's going on, and some of the industry responses. And then at the end, maybe I'll give you a prep for what to expect in the next 2 to 6 weeks and beyond that are sort of actionable, proactive, reactive opportunities for y'all in addressing air quality. So let's go to the next slide. One of the things that happened last year was that prior to the killing of George Floyd and to the racial justice demonstrations and unrest that followed, NACAA started out on a mission to revise its mission and values to incorporate issues of equity and environmental justice. We started up that conversation, and then, you know, everything kind of started happening, and that accelerated our process. And in the end, we last October, after having spent some time being deliberative and then having been accelerated and catalyzed by the national moment, put out a statement and direction on racial justice that's actually and environmental justice that is really refocusing a lot of what, as an association, we're doing to not only continue to succeed in the project of ensuring that regional air quality delivers benefits to most Americans, but also to take the additional steps on top of that to see the clean air success story delivered in a much more localized way to the communities that 30 years ago were bearing the most disproportionate burden of air pollution in their public health, and who today are the exact same communities that studies are showing, in spite of 30 years of progress in the sort of the regional ambient air quality project. So this priority that NACAA got engaged in also is reflective of some changes in the paradigm of thinking about what does success look like for air quality that we're seeing here in Washington, D.C. now that the administration shifted and now that there's new faces in Congress as well. Let's go to the next slide. After the November election, NACAA gathered together its family and put us all around a table and said, you know, what should we do to successfully engage with the new administration? And at the time, we were pretty sure that the House would remain Democratic, but that the Senate would be held by the Republican Party. And so as we were developing this, we were trying to make a list not of the things that we liked, but of steps that were achievable in that context that we could really do to advance our shared clean air mission to drive clean air outcomes for all. And so we tried to be really pragmatic about that. And in that context, I mentioned that we expected there to be divided government because there's very little that's legislative in our transition paper. And so when we said, well, what do we care about and what are we going to try and get? What are we going to try and win on? What are we going to try and do? A lot of it is regulatory focused. And these are the things that we asked the administration to work with us on. And you can see the first one there is to center environmental justice. We had some specific stuff on that. To respect state and local authorities as a pillar of the Clean Air Act. And that's not just California and cars issues and the like. The way the Clean Air Act is written, the first, clean air agencies were local and state agencies. And the Clean Air Act was written not with the role of cities and counties and states as like a quirk of the act. It's a pillar of the act. It's the foundation of the act. And we'd sort of moved away from that, not just in the last administration, but for the last while. And we want that back. It starts looking ill-formed when that foundational attribute isn't acknowledged in federal policy. We called for EPA to return to scientific and technical integrity for their core actions, to advance new programs that protect public health and address climate change, to reset permitting and enforcement priorities, to emphasize public health and equity, to improve the technical assistance that they deliver us, and to address the urgent need for significant increases in federal funding, which, as it turns out, is looking like it's been our main legislative win so far, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then finally, this overarching question, which is to really act in partnership with our agencies, not just in asking us for comments on their stuff, but by involving agencies like many of the ones that are on board on this call at the design phase of how do we go about accomplishing our clean air mission, pivoting to understanding and serving more localized impacts, and really addressing the climate crisis that's gone neglected for some time now. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So there's obviously a bunch of new faces. EPA Administrator Regan from North Carolina has been confirmed and moved in. Joe Goffman's been brought in to be the acting head at OAR. He may be named to be the permanent head at the Office of Air and Radiation. And in that position has the catbird seat on a lot of the air quality issues that'll matter to us. Some of the things will happen in other places though. Secretary Buttigieg has been brought in to run the Department of Transportation. Some of the appointments that have gone up to NHTSA have come from South Coast Air Quality Management District. And so y'all all know those folks pretty well, I think. And there's been much more emphasis across the EPA and NHTSA appointments that have drawn from the leadership that's been shown by local agencies in California and local and state agencies across the country. When we talk about, good decarbonization strategies in transportation, good low carbon mobility strategies for cities, when we talk about environmental justice programs that are tied to clean air, like point me to the nearest federal program that does any of that. They don't. All the stuff that's known in those arenas, all the stuff that's been learned the hard way, all the bitter battles that have been lost and won to deliver lessons learned have been done by local and state agencies. And a lot of that expertise is being drawn up into the federal infrastructure, which is awesome. We've got climate advisors, Kerry and McCarthy up at the White House. The White House is also being populated by a bunch of folks who care about environmental justice issues and the climate crisis and who have a good understanding of clean air issues. Secretary Granholm from Michigan is a big EV advocate, really understands sustainable mobility, really gets the car sector. A lot of the appointments at energy efficiency and renewable energy draw from not political donors, but world-class academic expertise or folks who really get energy storage or the like. It's really like a Olympic dream team basketball squad that they're bringing in to some of these ranks. And then at FERC, which has a big role in transmission and which in California has regulatory authority over the operations of the California Independent System Operator. Right now, the chairman's Rich Glick, who's a Democrat, and Allison Clements is another Democrat. But until June, it's going to be a 3-2 Republican majority. And what we've seen is a number of FERC decisions, most recently evaluating the climate impacts affiliated with a natural gas pipeline that was a brokered deal that one of the Republican members broke with the other two Republicans and voted with the Democrats on that. So right now we're seeing that, there's even glimpses of bipartisanship at places like FERC on issues like climate change. Okay, let's continue into the next slide. A lot of the NACAA asks were, we made a letter in the transition letter that was sort of like a letter to Santa. We'd love to have on Christmas morning the following things and trust us, we've been good. Santa delivered a lot of that on January 20th. Or if it didn't deliver all the way, the executive orders that were signed in on day one did lay the foundation for, thank you, Adrian, that's such a helpful addition to the chat. It laid the foundation for progress in the direction that we'd asked for. So we could really see a lot of the clean air priorities that we're hopeful for on that first day. I was a little bummed because as a DC resident, we all like to have our inaugural balls. My favorite's the black tie and boots ball. And I was hoping I would go to that, but instead the president went back to the White House and signed all these great executive orders that helped us on a lot of these things. There's also executive orders on restoring and elevating science and really establishing a lot of institutional infrastructure that enables environmental justice to be centered in a lot of the decision making around clean air and climate, addressing the climate crisis. Let's go to the next slide, please. There's also a number of deregulatory pauses. The previous administration had a deregulatory agenda. A lot of the deregulatory issues that were put into place have been paused. Some of them are being figured out in court. Some of them, I think there'll be regulatory action to rescind and put into place through notice and comment processes. Replacement for those. Just want to say yesterday, Congress, both the House and the Senate put out Congressional Review Act, their first Congressional Review Act movements to address and undo a regulatory or deregulatory or some sort of action by EPA on the methane emissions that come from the oil and gas industry, which I can get into deep geek territory with that if you're interested in during Q&A. But there's a bunch of different ways that the deregulatory and regulatory tides are shifting back in the other direction at the hands of this administration and Congress. And so we've seen a bunch of those. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'm trying to go quick because I don't want to use up all your time. What we didn't expect back in November, December was that the election would also deliver a unified government to the Democratic Party. That makes the president's agenda not easy, but not impossible. The two seats in Georgia that went to Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff delivered, full governmental control from the legislative and executive branch. So that matters. Senator Tom Carper is the new head of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia is the new head at Energy and Natural Resources. And Carper's instincts are progressive, and Manchin's, I would say, are centrist. And he's very interested in seeing bipartisan deal making and is willing to go to the mat for that. There's a number of new bills that have been put out. Three of the most important pieces that I think are worth noting are the Clean Future Act that's been introduced in the House. It's fairly comprehensive. It has environmental justice titles, it has transportation titles, it has a clean energy standard title. It does not put a price on carbon. It does not create mechanisms for a carbon tax or cap and trade or anything like that. It does create a pretty significant role for states, and by extension for folks like y'all who have good hooks in as you're trying to figure, good mechanisms for addressing planning by the state. It uses a SIP-like process for states to develop plans to conform with it. It sets pretty aggressive targets for decarbonization, resulting in a net zero by 2050 for economy-wide, and decarbonizing the power sector and the transportation sector significantly faster than that as well. So that's sort of the bill to watch. But right now, the question is, it can't be passed unless they either use a budget reconciliation route, which the Clean Future Act would probably not be eligible for, or unless the Democrats decide to blow up the filibuster, which is a possibility. But as of right now, the president's sort of signaling he doesn't want that. And there's enough Democrats who are not interested in it that it's just sort of circling the airport for now. There's a companion Republican energy package that addresses things like R&D spending, innovation, nuclear power, permitting reform, and a number of other pieces. So, it's not just the way these bills work is they get introduced in one session, they get introduced in the 114th, and then they end up not getting to be legislation until like the 118th session of Congress. Right now we're in the 117th. So some of these may be for future sessions of Congress. Every 2 years we get a new one. There's also numerous smaller bills, and I think a lot of those have a mixed bag of promise for movement. Things like having a climate infrastructure resilience study by DOT, putting climate back into health programs at the Centers for Disease Control, legislation from the Republicans blocking the adoption of anything under the Paris Agreement unless it's renegotiated through the Senate, those kinds of things. So there's plenty of other things out there. With this unified control, because of how it, as long as the filibuster is in place, the only way that legislation is going to move is either if it's bipartisan, which on climate is not super common. There's a few areas that could see some bipartisan agreement, but mostly it can be done just by the Democrats if it's done through a process called budget reconciliation. And there are rules about what kinds of things can go into budget reconciliation, and that takes a lot of stuff off the table. We did just see some COVID stimulus funding pass. That includes some language that we worked pretty hard at NACAA to get included, which added $50 million to the tab for this year to the grant funding that goes to state and local clean air agencies. We don't exactly know how it's going to get apportioned, and probably the last thing you want to do as an association is put the food down in front of everybody and then start telling the agencies sitting at the table who gets to eat what portion. Be a pretty quick way to be out of a job. So we're letting EPA figure that out, but we've been communicating to them with letters and with in-person, intimidating demeanor and that kind of stuff, that we then got other money for them. That money's for us. So we'll see how that apportionment works out. But that might mean in fiscal year 2021 that we've managed to produce a $50 million increase to a funding situation that's been flat, not flat considering inflation, but just plain old flat since 2004. So that would be a real win if we were able to pull that off. We're also working with the appropriators, which there's a new appropriator crew, Sherry Pingree from Maine and Jeff Merkley from Oregon would be our most important House and Senate points of contact on this. We're hoping for a sort of a structural improvement in the appropriations situation. And if we can't do it in the next 2 years, I'm not sure it's possible to be done. There's 2 large infrastructure packages in the pipe, and I'm mentioning this, and I'm going to come back to it right at the end, because this is where y'all should really put your thinking caps on. The administration wants to move really big infrastructure spending. It's possible they'll be able to do it on a bipartisan basis or through reconciliation, but we're talking not billions, but trillion plus dollars. So if there are things that you want bought, if there are investments that you need made, now's the time to really start thinking, what's your punch list, so that when your member of Congress calls you and says, you got 20 minutes to get 6 lines of text into the infrastructure bill, what's it going to be? You want to have that ready. You don't want to have that be like, let me get back to you in 3 weeks. I certainly don't want to get back to my guys in 2-3 weeks. So I'm getting my, we're loading up for bear on that in case we manage to get those things. And I'm in regular contact with those folks. So if you have specific asks, don't wait for your congressman to call you. Go ahead and let Erik and the other folks, Dr. Ayala and the other folks on this call who are NACAA members know what those are. And NACAA will go to the mat for those things on behalf of our family. There's finally, we're looking at the next appropriations roundup coming up in the next month or so. We'll start testifying about appropriations. And like I said, there's new folks in charge of the appropriations, both for House and Senate. They've done us the favor of not cutting us for 17 years, but we're looking for a big structural boost in that. And I think it's probably in y'all's interest to see a big structural boost in that as well, given that many areas of the region that you're in are flirting with real air quality harms to the public that are outside of your entire control to repair. There's things that require federal action or national action in order to kind of improve. Let's go to the next slide, please. Finally, the courts are making a bunch of decisions. A lot of the things that we asked for, the courts have already moved on. The ACE rule was vacated in court in January. The DC Circuit has granted EPA and NHTSA's motion to put the Safe Rule Part 1, which revoked California's CARS waiver and did a bunch of other stuff, to put that in abeyance. The Transparency and Regulatory Science rule was vacated in February by the courts. And a number of other rules that NACAA commented that we had technical problems with, or that had reasons why they didn't advance, clean air, or didn't, had analytic problems or other things wrong with them, are under review by the Biden EPA or are subject to litigation. So all of those are in the mix for changes, and hopefully, whatever comes up is good for, all parties, but is good for clean air and public health. Next slide, please. And we're seeing a raft of actions by companies. A number of the car companies withdrew from the SAFE litigation, that was the Clean Cars litigation. The GM, Toyota, Hyundai, and others had aligned with the administration. Other car manufacturers, Ford, Honda, VW, BMW, had aligned with California and with other states in opposition. And most of the folks who had aligned with the federal government against California have abandoned that position. There's also huge new investments in electrification that are being announced. GM says that they aspire to eliminate their tailpipe emissions from light duty vehicles by 2035. GM, Ford, VW are all partnering up with, Korean battery manufacturers and building battery facilities in Tennessee and Poland and all kinds of places. And the power sector is the same. EEI has said that, they can get us to zero emissions if we don't do it in dumb ways. The Electric Power Supply Association, which is a largely fossil fuel-oriented competitive power producer segment of the power fleet, have said that they have support for broad electrification and decarbonization through markets. And even API just this week announced their support for carbon pricing. It was a little bit cagey, but the fact that they were willing to recognize that they could get in on the design phase of something means that there's been pretty significant resistance from the oil and gas sector and from the API members on the decarbonization project. And now they're moving towards, expressing support for things if they can make it work for those guys. So that's a big shift. And so we're seeing these companies moving in those directions in anticipation of regulation and in anticipation of ability to be prosperous in a post climate or post carbon world. Let's go to the next slide. I think that might be the last one. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I tried to speed through this thing. I probably didn't do justice to some stuff. I appreciate y'all listening, and whatever you can do to be nice to the NACAA members on the call, please do that.
Well, thank you, Miles, for that. That was incredibly substantive. We always appreciate your briefings. As background, the Cleaner Air Partnership does, a big part of our work is federal advocacy for air quality programs and policies every year. And so that's largely through the Sacramento Metro Chamber's amazing Cap to Cap program. And we always make sure to meet with Miles at least once prior to going to DC and to nail down our priorities and kind of see what the strategic things we need to get going on. So Miles, looks like there's a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to read those out loud and then respond to them.
Yes, I do. The first one is prospects for new EV car rebates they're good. They're real good. They're real good. There's some conditions around that that will be a little bit tricky to solve. The administration's already announced that they're basically flipping the federal fleet to EVs, but they only want to buy EVs that are made in America by union employees. Right now, such a vehicle does not exist. They will need to catalyze the companies moving in that direction, or they'll need to adjust their ambitions. I think the EV rebates thing is extremely likely in the infrastructure push, and if it doesn't go that way, it's probable to show up in standalone.
Well, Miles, I think you froze.
This would be the best of all worlds. Oh, hello.
We lost you for a few seconds, Miles.
Am I back? Anyways,
Yes,
the
you're
EV
back.
stuff is good. I think the EV prospects are extremely good. The second question I got is, what is the role of the Center for Environmental Justice? And I don't know those folks, so I don't know. I do think that environmental justice is having a moment, and I don't think it's just a moment. I think it's really, they're taking seriously the notion of pivoting to taking that as they're writing it into the DNA of the actions that they're taking at EPA. I can't speak for the rest of the government, and I can't speak for what's happening on the Hill, but the specific center, I don't know what that is, or what their goals and ambitions are.
So let's knock out these final two questions and then move on. There will be more Q&A, and I'm sure folks will have more questions, but looks like these last two, and then we'll switch over, okay?
That's great. Okay, so the next one is, why do I think API likes a carbon price, and is NACAA asking the administration for a carbon price? I'll do them in reverse order. NACAA is not asking for a price on carbon. We're mechanism agnostic. What we care about is the reduction in the emissions, and so where market mechanisms are the best way to deliver that, that's great. And where a CES or a fuel standard or some other mechanism is the right way to deliver that, that's great too. So we're not asking for a price on carbon, but we're not gonna be mad if one shows up. As long as it's well designed. The API ask, there are cynics out there who think that API can ask for a carbon tax because they know it'll never pass. There are non-cynics like me who think that they're recognizing that there's an opportunity to do right and prosper at the same time if we design the markets right. Right now, almost all our cars drive around based on oil. So we're probably gonna, those guys aren't gonna go quietly. It would be much better if they didn't go, and they didn't have to go quietly, but they drove us to a total decarbonization, and we all did well doing it. Yeah, so I think there's a mix of reasons, depending on what your perspective is. Does the administration recognize that hydroelectric power is clean air power? I would say they absolutely do. I don't know about the administration's opinion of biomass plants or forest. I know that the administration has made helpful sounds about nuclear power. It is absolutely not NACAA's position to support advanced nuclear reactors or anything like that. But Miles Keogh kind of likes them. So when you spend R&D on a good project and it results in reduced emissions, I think that those are easy things to sell to people. from a policy perspective. I think the specifics around biomass are going to be, a combination of what the clean air benefits are, what the trade-offs are to get there, what I don't know where the administration is on that. Gridlock with electric. Oh, I'm sorry. How much EV infrastructure is in the proposed $3 trillion package? It hasn't been written yet. We don't know yet. And then finally, gridlock with electric cars. A big picture look at this needs to happen. Fast electric buses. I'm a bicycle commuter, so add bike lanes and e-bikes to that list of things, and you personally got me. In as much as other folks are looking at the electric car future, there's some really interesting studies that I would point y'all towards. Two of them. One is by Dr. Costa Samaras at Carnegie Mellon University, who really broke down the reduction in vehicle miles traveled that you need to go along with electrification to meet different climate goals. And another one that's really good by Dr. Jesse Jenkins at Princeton University, who looked at the infrastructure needs in terms of roads and bridges and bike lanes and pedestrian stuff, all the different kinds of vehicular needs that you would need to decarbonize, that has a pretty strong congestion and pedestrian safety and driver safety focus as well. So I commend those two, Costa Samaras from CMU and Jesse Jenkins from Princeton.
Awesome. Thank you, Miles, for that. And really appreciate it. Hope you'll stay on the line for the next couple of sessions. First, we're going to go to, thank you. First, we're going to go to Erik White to contextualize what Miles talked about, and then talk about specific priorities that we're thinking about for our region. And again, as alluded to earlier, the Cleaner Air Partnership does a lot of federal advocacy each year, largely through the Sacramento Metro Chamber's Cap to Cap program. We're interested in doing something a little bit above and beyond what we've done in the past, and actually have a sort of a spring effort, AKA this spring, AKA like the next 2 months, to schedule some meetings with folks in DC, begin to build some relationships with some of the new faces that Miles talked about, and begin to seed some of the priorities that Erik is about to discuss. So again, we're looking at the next couple of months to begin to schedule some meetings. I think there may well be an opportunity for those of you on the call who are interested in that to plug in. And I think we want to build something that's accessible. I know not everybody gets to go to DC on Cap to Cap. Not everybody is a skilled lobbyist or advocate for the things that they care about. But I think we're really interested in trying to bridge community voice to a lot of this ongoing advocacy that we've been doing for years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erik to contextualize some of this stuff for our region. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Just to elaborate a little bit more on what Adrian just walked through, as we think back what seems like an eternity 12 months ago, as we were planning for the Cap to Cap trip in 2020, as we do every year, the CAP executive team, with input from many of you on this call from around the region, put together a list of asks, things that we would like to go advocate for on behalf of the region. It includes things like funding, it includes things, policy programs around electric vehicles and communities and forest resiliency and things like that. And so as we are starting to emerge from COVID, and as we are starting to think about, and I say we, it's really the Sac Metro Chamber starts to think about the resumption of the Cap to Cap effort that we go through and participate in, I think there were many of us on the CAP executive team, and certainly John Lane and myself were the team leaders on the air quality portion of that, felt that while there wasn't a formal program for spring 2021, and I think as you heard Miles kind of walk through everything that's going on in DC right now, that if we simply waited to do something in the fall or even to next spring, we're missing an opportunity to get in at the ground floor and start to influence policy as it's being developed now. We saw how quickly the COVID relief bill made its way through Congress to the president's desk and was signed. Heard Miles talk about infrastructure is the next big ticket item that's being debated. And so I think it's important for the region to let our elected leaders know back in DC, and let the political appointees on many of the federal agencies that we interact with understand what our priorities are, so that, as Miles said, when we get the call and then we say, you've got 20 minutes to tell me how you'd spend $100 million in the Sacramento region, we've got an answer for that. And thank you, Adrian, for kind of sharing a little bit more about what Cap to Cap is. So I think next slide, please. So as we went back and started to look at our 2020 asks, and start to think about what 2021 should be, clearly much has changed in DC. And so we've gone back to try to highlight a number of areas where we want to focus our efforts. Some of those, this realignment, so to speak, is important to match with what we're hearing from the White House, what we're hearing from Congress, what we're hearing from the courts. And so we've kind of bunched things up into six categories that I think are important for us to focus our advocacy on, focus our asks on. And so today, what we've discussed is try to get some feedback from you all on the call about, are we missing anything? Are we focusing in the right area? None of these are new areas, but they are re-emphasized. And some of it is to really challenge the federal government as well to start to match some of the initiatives that are going on in California. For the last 4 years, California has led when, quite honestly, we've not had leadership in Washington on a number of these issues. So now there's an opportunity to try and encourage Washington to play some catch up and match what we're doing here. Forest health investments, I guess, since that's one that's very near and dear to me and residents in Placer County, I put that as number one. But really, we've seen a tremendous investment at the state level over the last many years on forest resiliency, wildfire fuel reduction projects. As we all experienced last summer, how do we respond to catastrophic wildfire smoke events? And so focusing a number of asks in that area around investment and increased pace and scale of fuel treatment in the federally forested land, which is the majority of the forested land here in California. There's great interest in clean air centers now to provide shelters for those who don't have a way to escape wildfire air events. And the question, I appreciate Randy asking this question of Miles, but how do we increase biomass utilization? If we're going to go in and treat all of these forested lands, what's going to come with the biomass feedstocks that are going to come off of them? What is typically done, and the least cost option, is to pile it up and burn it. I think many of us in the region recognize there are much more effective things that can be done with that, value-added things, renewable efforts that could go on to utilize that. And so we think that that's important to carry forward. That has been part of our message over the last several years. Again, an opportunity to increase that. Grid reliability and electrification, not to rehash what many of us in this region experienced last summer with rolling blackouts, but also building on what Texas saw in terms of their grid and its ability to respond to extreme weather events. If we're going to move forward with policies that are going to drive electrification in the transportation sector, how do we ensure that the grid is going to be able to support that shift? I don't think, for those who are supporting that work, having examples of where the grid couldn't support the existing situation today is a detriment to those efforts. So we need to think about how to do that. And I think the transportation infrastructure that Miles talked about is one of these areas where we have an opportunity to get funding made available to help harden the grid system such that we can do that. And not just with energy, but also energy storage and hydrogen. Important things to include as we talk about that. Transportation infrastructure. Again, this gets into how do we improve the existing system that we have, not just putting more, I think it was an adept observation, not just putting more EVs on the road to replace gasoline and diesel vehicles, but how do we start to look at mode shifts, improving alternate modes of transportation, active transportation, those types of things. And so it is more than just putting EVs on the road. It is re-envisioning how we move both ourselves and our passenger cars, and also how we move freight. The safe vehicle rule, we've had many conversations about how the greenhouse gas standards for light duty vehicles were changed under the prior administration. This administration has committed to go back and relook at those, as well as allow for an opportunity to set new standards, not just in the near term, but in 2027 and beyond. And so this is the time for us to get our input in on those efforts that are going on at US EPA. Heavy duty truck emissions, this is a significant issue in the Sacramento region as we think about attainment of federal ambient air quality standards for ozone. We need additional NOx reductions here in this region. California has stepped forward on setting more aggressive emission standards for NOx from these engines, but so many of these vehicles originate and are destined for places outside of California. So as an aggressive and effective national programs is necessary for the Sacramento region, and not just the Sacramento region, in the San Joaquin Valley and the Southern California area as well, on aligning with the California program to deliver emission reductions that are 90% cleaner than what we see on new engines and new trucks today. And then funding for local projects. And we put this on here because as we've come to recognize in Congress, and it was telling that the Republican caucus made a change on this position just last week, that earmarks are something that are not going to be opposed in funding bills moving forward, and budget bills. And so understanding and having projects, shovel-ready projects that can be put into these types of bills to ensure that funding comes to the region is going to be important. And so again, as I will go back to what Miles said, having things that we can quickly respond and provide to our elected leaders back in DC is going to be very important for us as these opportunities arrive moving forward, not just through our advocacy and cap to cap, not just through a potential more limited spring advocacy that we're talking about, but on an ongoing and regular basis. So with that, Adrian, I kind of walked through that. I think it would be good to get some feedback. And as I've been doing that, I've seen in the corner of my eye, there have been a number of comments that have come up in the chat. And maybe that'd be a good place to start a dialogue on this.
Yeah, agreed. So it looks like Paula, so there's comments from Paula and Dave suggesting the retooling of lumber mills to accommodate smaller logs, I think to the point about biomass. Dave, to the point about electrification, we need to look at the issues that cropped up in Germany with their move toward electrification. And then I don't know if you want to answer the question from Paula, how has the pandemic changed the use of infrastructure?
Well, I guess I will say on the use of infrastructure, I will say what has the impact of the pandemic been on transportation related issues. And I guess I'll focus on congestion, and I can speak for Placer County. I think as recently as last week, I heard the director of the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency share that transportation traffic patterns and congestion is back to 90% of what it was at pre-COVID levels. And so as we reopen, as people are returning to work, I think many of the issues that we were grappling with in early 2020 and in 2019 around how do we get people out of their cars, and I think a grand hope that out of COVID would become increased teleworking, and we would have less congestion in our existing infrastructure. think we're going to find that maybe those hopes were a little optimistic, and that people are going to return to their cars. And so we have to continue to start to plan for some of the things we were talking about pre-COVID around alternative modes of transportation, efficiency improvements in our infrastructure, and those types of things. That's my perspective, and there's others, and Alberto may have information, more specific to Sacramento County or some of my other counterparts, but I can tell you that's what we're seeing in Placer County.
Mhm. Thanks for that. And yeah, we're getting also recommendations around from Patrick Gild with Breathe. He's saying that broadband, could be embedded into number 2 or number 6. Just considering telework education. And then Brandon has a question, and again, we don't have to just be making Erik answer all these. I'm curious as to anybody's feedback or ability to answer these questions. But what's the role of zero emissions trucks versus cleaner combustion? And Brandon, do you want to maybe expand on that? I'm not sure I understand the question.
I don't have anything super specific, but I would think if we're advocating that we would want to advocate for lower GHGs, which would be more on the zero emission side than sort of optional low NOx standards.
I could share my perspective, and I bet if you asked from the air regular perspective, and Brandon, I know your role at CARB, you play a significant role in what the state is doing. I think we have to have a multi-pronged strategy as it relates to heavy duty transportation that does 2 things. One, allows us to continue to achieve meaningful progress towards attaining air quality standards, and that is to continue to drive NOx emissions down. We're not going to completely eliminate NOx emissions in the transportation sector. There are some very encouraging developments that are coming along from engine manufacturers and truck manufacturers around where zero emission can go, both for, say, hydrogen as well as electrically fueled vehicles. But we have to recognize that the infrastructure, is not yet there. It's one of the things I think that provides an opportunity and what Congress is considering for us to get some investment there. And so as we think about near term, I think continuing to drive NOx emissions down, and we talk about low NOx, is going to be very important. I think there's opportunities to couple that with low carbon fuels so that we're driving down carbon emissions from these vehicles, as well as the tailpipe emissions from that. But obviously the goal is to zero. And I think many of us on this call would agree that that is our goal. But if we're talking about 2035 for the light duty sector, we have to recognize the heavy duty sector lags. And so if we simply wait for zero emission vehicles to show up in the heavy duty sector, we're not going to make that progress that I think technology is going to provide from a low emission combustion perspective. That's mine. Others may have other opinions, but that's certainly the perspective that I have.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, and it looks like both Bill Mueller, hi Bill, and Susan Rainier are elevating building electrification. That is something that we don't have on here specifically called out. Anyone from the Cleaner Air Partnership Executive Committee have a hot take on that, on building electrification as a federal priority? Looks like Alberto is responding via text. Do you want to respond verbally as well?
Happy to. I would say that is a really good point that Bill is making, because not only do we need to incentivize electrification of the built environment, but we also need to pursue the regulatory instrument route, which is new requirements, new regulations, new standards. And I provided as an example what the city of Sacramento is currently doing with their very specific ordinance, where following our work in the Mayor's Climate Commission, all new buildings with certain characteristics are going to be required to go fully electric. So no more natural gas combustion. So I think it's a great point, and we should definitely engage Bill and others in it. Adrian.
Great. Yeah, and then So to the point about the funding for local projects, and thank you, Erik, for going into some more detail on that. I know we do have Matt Citato with Congressman Bera's office on the line, who has been sharing some information about the community. What exactly is it called? The community project funding. And so this is sort of like what used to be called earmarks back in 2010. And I don't think, you know, earmarks have been used since 2010, but it's a way for our congressional representatives to identify 10 projects in their district for priority consideration for funding. And so that appears to be coming back. I think it's going to be different, like as in it's going to be a more transparent process. You know, earmarks went away for a reason. And so just to be mindful of some of these priority projects as sort of that conversation moves forward too. And I know SACOG has already elevated priority projects to our congressional delegation. New locomotive emission standards from Bill McGavern.
I can say something on that. I was going to reply to Bill if we didn't touch on this, and just to say, Bill, that I think there's agreement that there are tremendous opportunities for Tier 5 and beyond emission standards. CARB and the San Joaquin Valley have petitioned EPA to establish those. The transition document that I know Adrian sent around from NACAA identifies and recognizes the need for the next round of emission standards from locomotives. So I think that is something that is going to happen on a number of different fronts. And I think as we think about this, and you know, it's not just kind of back to the conversation around trucks. It's not just around cleaner combustion standards, but also identifying and advocating for electrification in this space as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of work to go on there. I will be candid though and say that as EPA is going down its list of projects and priorities that it needs to get to, cars and trucks are at the top of their list. But I would hope and expect that as they start to make progress in those areas, that locomotives will be part of that effort.
Great. And also just want to call out Jennifer Wood, again, longtime cap-to-cap air quality team participant. Her comment just regarding the infrastructure bill. If that's moving forward, we should be ready for it. I agree with you, Jennifer. Totally agree. So thank you all for some initial feedback on these priorities. We're going to continue we'll take all the feedback that we've received in, and we'll continue to workshop and craft these, again, with an eye toward an effort this spring that there may very well be an opportunity for you to be more involved in. So we're really excited about that, and just want to thank Erik. And actually, before we do that, Jesse, could you switch the screen over? This is a sneak preview, or go to the next slide rather. So in a normal cap-to-cap setting, I think I posted in the chat, we would have like 20-something meetings in just a couple of days. This is kind of like what we would be considering in a normal cap-to-cap process. I don't think we're trying to schedule 20-something meetings, you know, regardless of the virtual aspect for our spring effort. But these are the sorts of folks that we would be meeting with, just as sort of to contextualize this for you. And I'm sure Miles is eyeing this closely and saying, oh, you know, has all sorts of tips for us having looked at this. But just wanted to share that. And I don't know if Erik, you have any comments regarding this before we move on.
No, I mean, obviously what we have for the spring is going to be a condensed version of this. And so, you know, I guess I would ask both, you know, you, Adrian, to make sure that we've captured the comments that that are in the chat, you know, to reflect in our asks for what we do. But also to share any priority contacts or meetings that you all think we should have out of this list, or any that are missing from this list, so that we can make sure we're not missing an opportunity to touch base with the right people and what is going to be a very condensed and limited opportunity, it looks like, this spring.
Yeah, so more on this soon.
Yeah.
And so thank you, Erik, for providing that overview. Before we switch over to talk state priorities, I actually have one more poll, which I'm going to launch now. The question is, which of the 6 federal priorities, and thank you, Jesse, for going back to the previous slide, which of those 6 priorities are you most familiar with? You can picture yourself in a if you're thrown into a meeting with our amazing Congresswoman Doris Matsui, you had to speak just to one of these issues or topics, which do you think you could be the most effective at? Just a fun exercise. We won't hold you to it. All right, and I'm going to keep it open for another 15 seconds, and then we'll get into state stuff. All right, 5, 4, 3, and let's share the results. Okay, so grid reliability and then transportation infrastructure tied for the top. Good to know. Forest health, funding for local projects, heavy duty trucks, and then safe vehicles rule, probably understandably in last place. It's yeah, complex. Okay, thank you all for answering the poll. Again, we love our polls. So last but not least, I would like to ask Jesse to advance the slides and introduce Alberto Ayala, who is the Executive Director and Air Pollution Control Officer at the Sac Metro Air District. Alberto, take it away.
Next slide, please, Jesse. Thanks for the invitation. Adrian, he reached out to me and asked me to help out by teeing up some of the state priorities that the CAP has been discussing, and I'm always happy to do that. And by the way, I want to thank all of you for participating. It's good to see everybody, at least virtually. Too bad we haven't been able to meet in person, but I do appreciate the fact that you've been listening for over an hour. I want to keep my remarks very brief so that hopefully we can hear from many more of you because you all have very important perspectives that we all need to hear. But anyways, Adrian asked me to step up and talk a little bit about what is happening at the state level. Miles and Erik did a very nice job talking about what is happening at the federal level. And of course, there's also a lot happening here at home. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to tee up is 3 simple concepts, topics. I'm going to keep it relatively brief. But for sure, the most important element of these remarks is the fact that we are at a crucial point in time with respect to public funding for clean air projects throughout the Sacramento region and beyond throughout California. Back in 1998, a new idea was born and implemented here in Sacramento. And that was the idea of using public dollars to modernize the fleet, because even back then, combustion emissions were recognized as a key culprit in our air pollution challenges. And lo and behold, guess what? Incentives were born, and they were the most effective mechanism to try to get to the quickest way to reduce emissions. Regulatory instruments like emission standards are obviously fine as well. They're just not quick. They take a long time to give you emission reductions. So incentives have been absolutely critical for all of us across the state to have made the progress in air quality that we have made. The reality of those incentives is that they are finite in time, and the current set of incentive funding that the state has dedicated is set to sunset in 2023. So right now, we're all, as air agencies and other stakeholders, many of you are in the virtual room participating, we're all mobilizing, making sure that the state reauthorizes these incentives. And I think the point of the discussion here is to hopefully get you, a lot more of you, to help us advocating at the state capitol that these incentives are absolutely necessary. They have been very successful, and I included in the slides some of the quantifications in terms of how many combustion engines have been cleaned, the emission reductions that we have achieved, some of the areas like school buses, for example, and ag equipment, which are key targets for these incentives. So please, I think the call to action here is please join us and help us advocate for these incentives. We want them to be reauthorized. The good news is the governor and his administration apparently agree, and they've actually included the reauthorization of these incentives in the proposed state budget. They're doing it for slightly different reasons, not necessarily purely clean air, But so be it. We will get these funds hopefully reauthorized for many years to come, so that we can continue to make progress on reducing emissions. The second area that I want to bring up for you is also this relatively new mandate, AB 617, community air protection, that is also becoming a real critical program for all of us. I'm sure you've all have heard about AB 617, and you will continue to hear about AB 617. We also need the funding that needs to go to AB 617 to be committed from the state. The analogy I use for AB 617, and in this particular element, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of good news and not so good news. AB 617 is like the genie is out of the bottle, meaning the state was very successful calling on communities and getting community engagement, saying, we're going to help you with mitigating the disproportionate burden from air pollution that still lingers in many of our communities that happen to be environmental justice, disadvantaged, low-income communities where many residents of color live. But from my perspective, unfortunately, it's a bit of an unkept promise. And I say that because the state hasn't really made the commitment in terms of the funding that is necessary to do what community air protection could actually achieve. And you can imagine what a big issue that is. Communities are you know, they believe in the promise, and they're asking for benefits yesterday. You know, we're dealing with, those of us implementing at the local level the program, we're dealing with the fact that there is no continuous appropriation for the program. So this is a yearly battle that we go through, and if nothing changes, you know, a year from now, we're going to be convening in this venue, and we're going to be saying the same thing. So this is something that we also need your help advocating for. Next slide, please. Something unique to us here in Sacramento, and it's a bit of an experiment. And this is our one legislative priority for the year, and that is we're asking for more flexibility from the state so that we can try to implement clean air projects that don't quite fit the mold that was originally designed into these incentive programs. As you can imagine, when the state makes an appropriation of funding for these programs, the state agencies develop guidelines on how to implement those incentive dollars. And then those guidelines and the monies come oftentimes to agencies like air districts for us to put programs in place. The guidelines tend to be fairly rigid, as they should. But we're asking for is it's a new day. Technology is evolving rapidly. The promise of zero emissions is here, is no longer a hypothetical. So we're asking for more flexibility in our region to specifically use the same amount of the same funding, the same programs, but really go beyond the traditional, you know, replacing a dirtier diesel engine with a cleaner diesel engine. We want to go beyond and do things that, for example, increase the tree canopy in the Sacramento region, which we know is absolutely essential to reach our climate adaptation goals. We want to participate in doing solar canopies, for example, and improve the livability of our communities with streetscaping and bike lanes and cool pavements and cool roofs. All of those things that are recognized clean air projects, but don't quite fit the existing guidelines that are guiding and directing the way that air districts, for example, implement these programs. So again, we hope that we can get your support for this. It's interesting that one of the co-benefits driving this effort is the fact that given the pandemic and how it has disproportionately impacted some sectors of our economy more than others, like for example, the service sector, the hospitality sector, if we could use some of these incentives, you could potentially have the co-benefit to create workforce development and jobs opportunities in non-traditional sectors, because you can hire crews to help you, plant trees around and partner with folks like SMUD, for example, and the Sacramento Tree Foundation, who have been doing a great job for many years increasing our canopy. And the reason we use canopy as an example is because we know that we are woefully behind the amount of trees that we need in a region like Sacramento. So again, this is one of our principal priorities for the year, and we hope to count on with your support. Next slide, please. And then the last topic I'll tee up is something that Erik already discussed. Obviously for us, wildfire mitigation and response support is also critical. In addition to the very good point that Erik made in terms of the feds hopefully matching some of the commitments that the state is making with respect to forest management and dealing with our fuel loading and all that. We've been implementing, working with the state, we meaning the air districts, about a $2 million a year program to essentially deal with some of the fuel issues, and then when a fire is impacting the state, that we deploy the necessary monitoring resources to make sure that we can provide information to the public at large, so they can make decisions that protect their health. So we want to continue to advocate for the state to not only continue the program, but really to put more money into it. I mean, $2 million a year is I would say a floor, not a ceiling. And we've unfortunately all experienced the fact that we're going to need to do more, not less, because wildfires are going to be part of our new normal reality. So with that, I will stop here. And I think at this point in time, Adrian, we go to general Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto. And yeah, before we do that, I just want to call attention to a couple of comments that came through. One from Supervisor Phil Cerna, who of course represents our region on the California Air Resources Board, calling to attention multifamily housing and EV charging, that being a perpetual issue. And then let's see, Brandon Rose on the SMUD board responded saying that could also be an opportunity to cap for the community resources development team, which is focused on housing. And then John Lane, who is the chair of the Cleaner Air Partnership. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, John, and share your question. Otherwise, I can read it for you.
I don't know if you can see me or not.
We can.
Well, it was just a general question that the timing's good to ask this of the general partnership itself, which is, a growing issue, both federally and state, is environmental justice or disadvantaged communities. And I think we would really like to get input, whether it's here at this forum or even directly to Adrian, of how the partnership feels the Cleaner Air Partnership can play a role. What role do we think that the Cleaner Air Partnership should play? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I think it's good food for thought, John. Just as a through line for all of our conversations. Also, just want to remind folks on the call that Valley Vision and through with several other partners, Walk Sacramento, Breathe California, and Green Tech Education here in Sacramento are working on a AB 617 funded community air grant to help deploy monitoring networks in Oak Park and in North Sac. And so we're making a lot of connections with residents in that regard. And I think a lot of those residents are interested in advocacy. And I know Dr. Ayala could say the same thing about the steering committee that he's working with in South Sacramento, Florent. The new connectivity to residents and folks living in affected neighborhoods is going to be a real asset in this work. And Evan, it looks like you're unmuted. Or sorry, it looks like I don't have your audio. So I'm not sure. Yeah, no. Maybe try calling in again or something. I'm not sure. And so Supervisor Cerna is also noting that CAP can help educate and organize in DACs to advocate for AB 617 funding. Yeah, absolutely.
That was really to Alberto's point, which believe me, as a member of the local air district as well, understand the frustration. It's very palpable in terms of not having the resources necessary to do what the state legislation requires, and can't emphasize enough, without sustainable funding for 617 implementation, it puts us in a very precarious position locally. If we're fortunate enough to have the designated areas. And as you just referenced, Adrian, we do have one in South Sacramento currently. So that's why I answered the way I did to John's solicitation for input about what CAP can do. I think organizing in disadvantaged communities with local community leaders to help speak with one voice alongside CAP and others to advocate at the right time to the right folks at the Capitol and the administration about the import of sustainable funding could be a game changer.
Any other feedback on what Alberto shared? Again, it was funding, it was wildfire, and it was flexibility, funding flexibility, which is pretty compelling.
Adrian, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good, thank you, and sorry about that. Hi, everybody. Evan Schmidt, CEO of Valley Vision. And I did just want to chime in, particularly about the AB 617 issue, and agree with Supervisor Cerna and Dr. Ayala's focus on this issue, because I think that without sustained funding, we would be at risk of doing more harm in those communities by kind of haphazardly engaging and then not having a sustained effort. So I think that the Cleaner Air Partnership has a real opportunity to help advocate for that, to advance that, and then also to, speaking to John Lane's point, to have a robust presence in making sure that we're elevating the need for clean air in disadvantaged communities and keeping that really on the forefront for our region. So, and I really thank all the presenters and the participation today. This is a really timely topic, really important for us to be engaging in. So thank you.
Maybe someone who hasn't chimed in quite yet, interested in any other feedback that folks might have for us. Again, anything clean air related at the state level. I do see Victoria Vasquez with Sac Tree Foundation talking tree canopy, and I think that's part of the conversation around flexibility of funding, right? You know, if funding programs are only going to stuff with engines and community members are calling for trees, then that's a problem, right? And it's something that we need to fix at the state level.
Hey, Adrian, let me quickly chime in. There's both on March 30th in the morning, there's a Building Standards Commission workshop that's looking at vehicle charging and heavy duty charging in construction. And then CARB has a funding plan workshop that morning as well for vehicle tech. So lots going on at the state level in my day job work.
Thank you.
Adrian, let's talk about the summit also.
Oh yeah, well, I was actually going to close with that, but yeah, sure. Let's get into it. So everyone on this call and others are invited to a really exciting event that Valley Vision, in partnership with the Sac Metro Air District, Councilmember Eric Guerra, Councilmember Mai Vang, SMUD, a whole bunch of folks are collaborating on next Tuesday, March 30th. And I'm going to post in the chat the link to this, but this is a climate justice and jobs summit that we are co-creating. The purpose of which is to grow green jobs in the Sacramento region, both through identifying local strategies and then creating a game plan for state level advocacy to that end. It's going to be 8:30 to 1 p.m., 8:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Everything from interactive working sessions to hearing the latest and greatest from experts, and also hearing from community members and graduates of Green Jobs programs right here in Sacramento. So we're super excited about it. I don't know if Alberto or others have something to add, but please RSVP. The link is in the chat.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, Adrian, is, I spoke about this legislative flexibility. The idea of the summit really was born out of that, if we can think of the way that we're using state dollars for clean air projects, but can we do it in a way that we get the co-benefits of perhaps workforce development, creating some jobs that otherwise would not have been there and still achieve the clean air goals. And when we started kicking that around, we realized that we as air quality practitioners are not equipped. And we really need to invite the other disciplines, folks who know about jobs and workforce development, folks who know about some of the other areas. And I'm pretty excited about the convening, and I hope many of you can join us.
As do I. Well, we are running low on time. We have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap us up. Again, thank you all for the wonderful conversation today and the feedback. We have saved the chat. We will be following up with each of you regarding both the federal effort that we are in process and then the state stuff we're working on. So thank you again. Of course, thank you to Jesse Flores, who did a fantastic job managing the back end and our slides. Thank you to Miles, who again is with us in DC. It's 4:30 p.m. on a Friday over there. Hopefully you have a cold beer in your fridge. And of course, to our fantastic lineup of experts, and last but not least, to the Cleaner Air Partnership's generous contributors for sponsoring the luncheon. So I'm about to share another link in the chat that I want you all to check out. And this is an evaluation form. As Evan, our amazing CEO, could tell you, evaluation is the name of the game. So please respond to that. It is a 1-minute evaluation. Shouldn't take longer, hopefully. So that allows you to not only gauge your interest in sort of this whole federal advocacy effort, but also to provide additional feedback for us in the interest of continuous improvement, and then also to seed some ideas for future luncheons. So check that out. And then lastly, a recording of this meeting will be available on Valley Vision's YouTube channel within 72 hours. I will send you all a link to this via email on Monday, and I hope you all enjoy your Friday afternoon. So thanks again for joining, and look forward to working with you all on this great stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.